The Catholic's Ready Answer by Reverend M.P. Hill.
Objection. Good works are not necessary for salvation, for St. Paul says, "We account a man to be justified by faith alone, without the works of the law." The answer. This is not what St. Paul said, but what Luther represented him as saying in his German translation of the Bible. For in the original text the word alone is not found. The word was introduced to give support to Luther's new doctrine on justification. Besides, St. Paul is here speaking not of the good works of the Christian religion, but of the ceremonial observances of the Jewish law, the various forms of purification, bloody sacrifices, and the like. Objection. But man is perverted and sinful, and therefore can perform no genuine good works. Answer. Man can perform no good works, at least works availing to salvation without Christ. But with Christ he can. For in the Gospel of St. John we are told by Christ himself, "I am the vine, you are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same beareth much fruit."
Grace. Objection. Catholics are forever speaking of the necessity of grace. Without grace, I can do nothing, is the common formula, and yet I can do many a good deed without feeling the need of God's help. The answer. The Catholic teaching on the subject is that without divine grace, I can do nothing that avails to salvation. That is to say that although I can do many things that are good without grace, I cannot do that kind of good that merits heaven. The kingdom of heaven, as Christ teaches, is promised as the reward of our labor in this life. See the parable of the workers in the vineyard, Matthew chapter 20. Heaven must be fixed as the goal of our present existence. We must so live in this life as to be entitled to possess God in the next. The end set before me is a supernatural one. The faith by which I apprehend it is supernatural, as my natural powers could never have brought me to knowledge of it, and hence the need of grace. And the faith planted in the soul by grace is made a living faith by the further action of grace, and produces the ripe fruits of hope and charity. The giving of an alms by an unbeliever is a good work of the purely natural order, and God may deign to reward it, but it has no merit as far as heaven is concerned. The motive is not supernatural, nor is it the fruit of supernatural faith. It is God's will that I should live by faith. The just man liveth by faith. Galatians chapter 3, verse 11. Without faith it is impossible to please God. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. There is a good deal of truth in the assertion that Catholics are forever speaking of the necessity of grace, and would that non-Catholics knew more of its necessity and felt more of its power. Grace would then be the solution of many problems which today are not even half solved. Divorce, with remarriage after divorce, is not even a half solution of the problem how to secure a happy union in wedlock, for it brings worse evils than it is designed to prevent, whereas the sacramental grace of a truly Christian marriage works miracles of harmonization between otherwise discordant hearts in the married state. The grace of the sacraments has vastly helped us in the solution of the problem regarding the formation of the Christian character in the souls of the young. Catholics cannot say too much about the need and power of divine grace. The consequences of the ignoring of grace are almost too evident.
Haeckel. On the tripod, the development of the individual life from the embryo form is but a representation in little of the development of the entire species from a primitive form. This is that irrefragable law which is the heaviest piece of artillery made to do battle for the truth. Under its repeated assaults, the magnificent fabric of the Roman hierarchy will tumble like a house of cards. Haeckel. The truth about Haeckel. Possibly some of our readers will ask, who or what is Haeckel? Others will doubtless have heard of him as a German professor of some notoriety, whose books have had no little vogue in English-speaking countries. Some few years ago, a cheap edition of one of Haeckel's books, entitled Welträtsel, English title The Riddle of the Universe, sold by the 100,000 in England, and many an unknowing reader had the pleasure of tasting a sample of what he was told was German science, the genuine article from the workshop of the best producer of the commodity to be found in all Germany. Haeckel, it must be admitted, has done some very meritorious work in his own special department of natural history, but for many years he has been impelled by an irresistible impulse to step out of his own legitimate province and play the role of philosopher. This has been the mistake of his life, for not only has he disgraced himself in the field of higher speculation, but even among his brother scientists, by reason of his charlatan spirit and his daring frauds, recently confessed by himself, he has covered himself with well-deserved obloquy. In his Welträtsel, he attempts to solve what he calls the riddle of the universe, that is to say, to account for the world as we find it, and trace all things back to their origin and to their ultimate elements. His philosophy is materialistic. All things consist of matter, and all have been evolved out of primitive forms of matter by virtue of a certain energy, which is an inherent quality of matter. The spiritual, in any right sense of the word, has no place in the system. God, soul, immortality are all relegated to the region of myths. The style in which the subject is treated by this would-be philosopher is of the quietly oracular kind. His treatise, so to style it, is a continuous stream of placidly self-confident assertion. He argues or discusses as little as a prophet. Viewed under another aspect, the book is an undignified appeal to the crowd. We may confidently assert that any other man of science who had a reputation to make or unmake would resent the imputation of being considered its author. For our part, we should never have mentioned his name in these pages, had not the powers of darkness made use of his reputation as a German scientist to poison the minds of thousands of unwary readers in English-speaking countries. Some lines above, we alluded to certain frauds associated with the name of Ernst Haeckel. They belong to the category of deadly sins, which are never forgiven the man of science. They consisted in a deliberate misrepresentation of facts. The ordinary student depends on the original investigator for a knowledge of facts, and facts are the very basis of all physical science. Hence a professor who knowingly distorts the facts presented to his pupils saps the foundation of science. This in a flagrant form is the offence of Ernst Haeckel. The circumstances were as follows. Haeckel is a Darwinist of the extreme type. He holds with Darwin that man has been evolved from the ape. In his search for arguments to prove his thesis, he has been for some years pursuing an idea to which he attaches much importance. If he could show from the actual prenatal life of man that the individual man is evolved from an embryo, which at an early stage of its growth cannot be distinguished from the embryos of certain other animals, the ape for instance, an actual case of evolution would be furnished, having an analogy with the evolution of the entire human species in the lapse of ages in the past. The reader will have perceived that so far as the argument could have any force at all, it would simply present an analogy between a natural case and a merely possible one. But even to effect thus much, the actual fact would have to be produced. Haeckel was equal to the task. In a pamphlet published in 1907 and entitled Das Menschenproblem, he exhibited some drawings of embryo men and apes, supposed to be taken from nature. In these representations, men and apes were shown to be exactly alike, and doubtless Haeckel rubbed his hands with Barnum-like glee at the success of his little venture. This was the first act of the little drama. In the second came the denouement. In 1908, Dr. Arnold Brass, after a careful study of the diagrams, proved conclusively that many of them were inaccurate and worthless, and others purposely and deliberately falsified. This scientific world was soon in a ferment, and a war of words ensued. It was brought to a close in 1909 by Haeckel himself in the following statement, made in the Münchner Allgemeine Zeitung. To put an end to this unsavoury dispute, I begin at once with the contrite confession that a small number, 6 to 8%, of my embryo diagrams are really forgeries in Dr. Brass's sense, those, namely, for which the observed material is so incomplete or insufficient as to compel us to fill in and reconstruct the missing links by hypothesis and comparative synthesis. I should feel utterly condemned and annihilated by this admission, were it not that hundreds of the best observers and most reputable biologists lie under the same charge. The great majority of all morphological, anatomical, histological, and embryonical diagrams are not true to nature, but are more or less doctored, schematized, and reconstructed. The controversy now entered a new phase. The scientific world had to defend itself against the sweeping charge under which Haeckel had sought shelter for his own poor head. Its defence was, to say the least, of a very dubious character. The following statement, signed by 46 professors representing 25 German and Austrian universities and scientific schools, was published in the Allgemeine Zeitung. The undersigned professors, directors of laboratories, etc., herewith declare that they do not approve of the method of schematizing which Haeckel has in some instances made use of. At the same time, in the interest of science and professional freedom, they condemn in the sharpest manner the warfare waged against Haeckel by Brass and the members of the Kepler-Bund. They declare, moreover, that the evolutionistic idea can suffer no detriment from some few inaccurately reproduced embryo diagrams. The evolutionistic idea suffers just as much as is involved in the loss of Haeckel's argument from analogy. Fraud has failed to bolster it up, and fraud was its only resource. Moreover, it should suffer considerable detriment from the last sentence of the document just quoted. The Kepler-Bund, a scientific society of the highest standing, felt itself bound to reply. A declaration was issued over the names of 25 scientists who were members of the Bund, and 11 who were not members. 19 learned institutions of Germany, Switzerland, and Austria were represented by the signatures. The declaration read in part as follows: "We are in agreement with the Kepler-Bund when it demands that henceforth, as in the past, German scientific research shall rest on an uncompromising love of truth and on the strictest personal sincerity." What should we say of a historian who should alter the letters of an inscription in order to put through a preconceived personal opinion? Haeckel's want of conscientiousness in popularizing scientific facts and philosophical speculations has been shown up by others besides Dr. Brass. We refer particularly to Wilhelm His, who in 1875 exposed the arbitrary manner in which Haeckel modified his scientific data. To declare as unimportant such arbitrary mutilations of the diagrams of other workers as Haeckel has been convicted of, by Ruttermeyer, His, and Brass, manifests a laxity of opinion to which we cannot assent. Haeckel is thus discredited by the signed verdict of 82 of the foremost German authorities, though to 46 of them it was evidently a sore task. And this is the man whose miserable travesty of science has been sapping the foundations of men's faith. And what a revelation does not the whole transaction make of what is going on in scientific circles in Germany, a country to which, for the rest, the world is so deeply indebted for its scientific knowledge. We may note, by the way, that Haeckel began his scientific frauds much earlier than the year 1907. In 1868, wishing to illustrate the identity and appearance of man, the dog, and the ape in their embryonic condition, he made 3 copies of one and the same drawing, and labelled them respectively man, dog, ape. Haeckel has noticed, and no doubt with keen regret, which he manages, however, to fob off with a smile, the large exodus from the ranks of the ultra-evolutionists occurring in the past few decades. But what will our readers think of a man who attributes the change of opinion that has taken place in the case of so many eminent scientists to the influence of age and increasing mental decrepitude? The diagnosis rebounds upon himself, and who fancies that the young and enthusiastic are more likely to lay hold of the truth than those who bring to their studies the ripe fruit of experience. Our readers can judge for themselves with what degree of success Haeckel has wielded the terrible piece of ordnance which is destined to make the Roman hierarchy tumble down like a house of cards. Hell. Objection. God is good and merciful, but a good and merciful God would not condemn a soul to eternal torments. Therefore, the eternity of hell is a contradiction of our belief in his goodness and mercy. The answer. God is good and merciful, but he is also just, and punishes sinners as they deserve to be punished, and a grievous offence against God deserves eternal punishment. God's loving kindness, on the other hand, is shown by the fact that he supplies, even superabundantly, the means of salvation, and by the fact that he bestows upon those who make a good use of those means a reward immeasurably greater than the absolute merit of those who receive it. Those who argue against eternal punishment or against God's mercy in connection with the eternity of punishment have the habit of fixing their gaze on one side of the picture and forgetting the other. The idea of eternal punishment so preoccupies their minds that they are well nigh incapable of thinking of the causes and circumstances of the punishment. And yet of all subjects, the punishment of the damned is the one that most requires to be considered in all its aspects, and that for the following reasons. 1. It is a matter concerning the Supreme Lord of heaven and earth, the infinite, eternal, and all-wise God. Of that Supreme Being we know, after all, so little that we should not turn the little knowledge we have of him into a weapon of offence against any of his attributes. 2. Of all the aspects of God's being known to man, that of his loving kindness and mercy is the one that is the most conspicuous in his dealings with mankind, and it is one that fills the human mind with inexpressible admiration. The abyss of his goodness and mercy is much more unfathomable than his motives for inflicting punishment. There is, it is true, a rigorous side to God's dealings with men, even during their mortal lives, that fills us with terror, but of that rigour we can, in some measure, divine the reasons. The pains and inflictions meted out both to individual men and to nations have often been the temporal punishment of crimes that have made the earth groan with the weight of the iniquities that have oppressed it, and the temporal punishment in many cases may have brought men to their senses and saved them from eternal punishment. Then, too, many of the temporal afflictions which men are all too prone to attribute to God as their source are not really attributable to him except in the sense that he has permitted them, that is to say, has not prevented them, but always for man's ultimate good. In cases in which a severe temporal punishment, only temporal and not eternal, so far as we have any means of knowing, has been given for what seemed a comparative trifle, as when Uzzah was rash enough to lay his hand upon the Ark of the Covenant, the punishment was intended to inspire the people with a sense of awe in dealing with sacred things. In the case of the chosen people, there was often need of a signal example of the divine displeasure following an act of irreverence, and the example often proves salutary for many a generation. Thus we can always find a reason for the severities of God's temporal rule, a reason that squares with our human sense of justice. But who will ever sound the depths of his loving kindness and mercy? Taking the divine bounties either singly or in their entire range, from creation to the beatific vision, who can ever say why or wherefore God should have conferred them at all? Why should he have created us, when he had no need of us, for he was infinitely perfect, infinitely happy. Who will ever discover a reason except in his ineffably mysterious goodness? And creation is but the beginning of an endless train of blessings, temporal and eternal. His creating us to his image, and thereby endowing us with intelligence and free will, the natural and supernatural gifts lavished upon the first two of our race, the rich rewards of virtue he bestowed upon the patriarchs, upon Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph, the care he bestowed upon the chosen people, in Egypt, in the desert, in the promised land, the abundant temporal rewards conferred upon the virtuous observers of the law. These are the unmerited and spontaneous outpourings of goodness which mark only one half of God's dealings with men. The other half must be sought in that new dispensation which is the fulfilment of the types of the old. The prophecies had teemed with descriptions of a new era in which the favours of the Almighty would be showered down in untold abundance as the dowry which the Eternal Father was to send into the world with his divine Son. God so loved the world as to give his only begotten Son. Here we have a new abyss of mercy which is more unfathomable than the first. The very life of the Saviour, apart from the innumerable blessings that came with him, would be sufficient of itself to prove that his mercies are the least comprehensible of all the things we know about God. But if we add to his life its superabundant merits, which when turned into graces form the inexhaustible treasury of God's church, if we add the graces and consolations and the foretastes of heaven which is received with the sacraments which our divine Lord instituted, we shall obtain even then but a faint conception of the love of the Creator for the work of his hands. The climax is reached when the joys of heaven are added, joy springing from the possession of the infinite God himself, and for eternity. Is it not true, then, that the abyss of his mercies is more unfathomable than his motives for inflicting pain? If, therefore, a God whose mercies are unspeakably great visits some of his rational creatures with eternal punishment, there must be motives for punishing which are worthy of his infinite attributes. The thought of hell necessarily awakens deep reflection. Let not such reflection issue in an impeachment of the divine mercy. Let it rather issue in a deeper sense of the enormity of sin, of the ingratitude of the sinner, and of the perversity of one who not only adds sin upon sin, but sets at naught the divine warnings heard in the depths of his soul. Let it also open to view that unseen world of grace in which God fairly besieges the soul with his merciful inspirations. We know not the number of the reprobate, nor can we presume to pass judgment on any sinner who has left this world, no matter how great his sin. But one thing we know, that no one was ever lost who was not lost, in spite of God's merciful designs in his behalf.
The human race, how old is it? A modern objection. In the mud of the Mississippi, skeletons have been found that must have been there at least 60,000 years. Hence, the Bible's reckoning of 4,000 years from Adam to Christ is discredited by physical science. The answer: it is anything but certain that the Bible reckons 4,000 years between Adam and Christ. There are varying texts and different versions of the sacred writings. If the genealogies given in the Latin Vulgate are to be regarded as determining the age of the human race, the successive generations of men do indeed make up a total of some 4,000 years, but according to the Greek Septuagint, more than 1,000 more must be reckoned. And yet both versions are in use in the Church. Ecclesiastical authority leaves it undecided which of the two accounts is the correct one, or whether both are not wrong, and a third, that of the original text, right. But a more important point still to be noted by students and readers of the sacred books is that even if the Vulgate, or the Septuagint, as the case might be, should be proved to be in all respects authentic and substantially trustworthy, the Bible need not necessarily be regarded as determining the age of the human race. Catholic biblical scholars whose orthodoxy cannot be questioned admit this view and support it with solid arguments. True, the names and ages of successive patriarchs are given in the Bible, and a plain reader of the text might consider it a simple problem in arithmetic to figure out the total age of the human race from Adam to Christ. But as scholars view it, the problem may be a more intricate one, not only because we have no certainty of the number of years in the original text of pre-Mosaic genealogies, but also because there are grave reasons for thinking that there may be gaps in the genealogies of the Bible, not, however, of a kind to detract from the Bible's inerrancy. The reasons in detail the reader will find in the articles in the Catholic Encyclopedia entitled Chronology, Biblical, and Genealogy in the Bible. Our only concern here is to state that there is nothing either in Catholic scholarship or in the pronouncements of the Church authority obliging us to hold that the Bible fixes the age of the human race as 4,000 or 5,000 or indeed any definite number of years. If neither scholarship nor authority can read an exact and complete chronology into the Bible, much less can the average skeptic, who lightly, and for the most part ignorantly, appeals to the results of scientific research. Apart from what we know from the Bible, the insignificance of our knowledge of primate man is indicated by the meager collection of prehistoric human remains preserved in our great museums. There is indeed an immense collection of implements, such as tools and weapons of flint, and a certain number of carvings and drawings, all of which give evidence of the manual skill and the mental capacity of the men belonging to the Stone Age, a period deriving its name from the use of stone implements before the use of metals was known. But the search for human remains, such as skulls, jawbones, or thigh bones, and especially for whole skeletons, has been much less fruitful. The following is almost a complete list of really important finds of prehistoric human relics: a human skull found in the Neanderthal Valley near Düsseldorf, and a few others of the same peculiar type. An underjaw found at Nollet in Belgium, a skeleton discovered at Cannstatt, Germany, a jawbone found in the Schipke cave in Moravia, the complete skeletons of a woman found at Spy in Belgium, a skeleton found at Olmo in Tuscany, a skull discovered at Igishima in Alsace, a skeleton found at Galley Hill in Kent, a jawbone found in a sandpit at Mau near Heidelberg, a jawbone and fragments of a cranium discovered at Piltdown in Sussex. These remains are in some cases the merest fragments of human skeletons, and much difficulty has been experienced in the task of reconstruction, that is to say, in the attempt to present an idea of the whole from indications supplied by the parts. In the case of the Piltdown remains, it is doubtful whether the jawbone and the imperfect cranium belong to the same individual, and whether they are both human. What is the value of these human remains? They would possess a considerable value to the student of prehistoric man if they bore any indication of their age, but their age is a matter of conjecture. Supposing they belong to the Stone Age, do they belong to the earlier periods of that epoch, or to the later? As regards the Neanderthal skull, Professor Virchow, whose authority will not be questioned, assures us that there is no proof that it dates from the early Stone Age, but admits that it may possibly belong to the later Stone Age. Its age is undetermined, he says, and it may be of a much later date. Quoted by Rank, Der Mensch 2, page 484. So speak the really great men of science about the significance of these remains, generally, as bearing on the age of the human race. They simply do not know at what interval the present generation stands from the time when these human relics were deposited in the places where they were found. They can guess, they can hazard calculations in which a number of ifs must be understood, but this is not exact science, and it should never be quoted as such against the Bible. The reader can form an idea of the present state of science in this connection when he is told that the estimates of the age of the race vary from 10,000 years, perhaps much too low a figure, to 10 million. The estimates that mount highest are generally those of evolutionists, who assume without a particle of proof that man was gradually evolved from the ape, and that the evolution required an enormous lapse of time. But evolutionary theory is one thing, well-authenticated fact quite another. But our opponents have another stone in their wallet. They appeal to the astronomical tables of the East Indians, but happily modern astronomy enables us to lay the objection to rest. The eminent astronomer Littrow is surely entitled to be heard on the subject. He says, "The astronomical tables of the Indians, to which they themselves attribute so high an antiquity, show clearly that they were drawn up at a time when the motion of Saturn was slowest and that of Jupiter fastest. And this circumstance enables us to determine with some certainty the time at which these tables were composed. If the eccentricities which they assign to several of the planetary orbits be combined, it becomes very probable, as Laplace has shown, that the tables, so far from having been composed 4,000 years before the beginning of our reckoning, really date from a period as late as the beginning of the 16th century after Christ, and were made after the model of European tables." Wonder des Himmels, page 831. Science has really nothing to say against the comparatively recent origin of man, and the Bible is in possession of the field. See Apes and Men and Evolution.
Indifferentism. The plea of the indifferentist. Religious creeds are a matter of personal preference, and a search for the right creed, if there is any such thing, cannot be expected of the average man. On the other hand, we all have a grasp of certain principles of morality which are the mainstay of society. With these, society may well rest contented. Our answer. We have dealt in another article with the watchword of the indifferentist, deeds not creeds, and have endeavored to show its absurdity. In the present article, we aim at being more helpful to the indifferentist by enabling him, if possible, to realize the gravity of the situation in which he finds himself, and by furnishing him with a positive clue to the discovery of the truth. The indifferentist believes, or tries to make himself believe, that the motto "deeds, not creeds" is the embodiment of common sense. Let us sift it a little. Ask a man of this way of thinking what deeds he means. Ask him to draw up a list of those deeds, which he thus sets over against the creeds, that is to say, of the acts and habits which he deems morally right. Ask a second and a third, and so on indefinitely, to do the same. You will find that no two such lists will in all points tally, and some will be much longer than others. One man's list of honest deeds will include no more than honesty, sobriety, obedience to the laws when they cannot be evaded, in the care of one's family, with perhaps a bit of philanthropy and public spirit thrown in by way of giving a sort of halo to the rest. These are only the deeds and duties without which even pagan society could not get on at all, and without which the individual would come to grief. Another vaunter of deeds as against creeds would add a few more virtues to his list. His moral sense is of a finer sort, and hence he adds to the catalogue meekness and patience, charity in words, mere thoughts would be under no moral restraint, and chastity, as a matter of outward behavior. Another would add sincerity, an approach to humility, and a restraint upon thoughts and desires. One would like to know, in dealing with such persons, where the line is to be drawn between the good and bad deeds. Why should one man's list of virtues be longer than another's? Have they any criterion by which to discover whether any one of them is complete and exhaustive? And then, what is the criterion for deciding whether any deed deserves to be called virtuous? Most men who are indifferent to positive creeds are quite at sea on these points. As to prayer and worship, well, they may have some vague notion of the fitness and reasonableness of the thing, but they would seldom think of entering it on the list of moral duties. And then the very notion of duty and obligation, which underlies all their ideas about virtue and vice, upon what is it based? The basis is either a rational or an irrational one. If it is a rational one, it will resolve itself into a judgment that certain things are right and ought to be done, whilst other things are wrong and ought to be avoided. In other words, into a dictate of conscience. But conscience must be based upon a belief, implied at least, that there is some higher power than our own wills, one to which our wills are subject. For there can be no duty or obligation unless it be imposed by a will which has a sovereign right over ours, the will of a personal deity. Any other basis for the notion of duty is irrational. You may see the expediency or the utility of doing certain things which you consider right, but that it is a duty for you to do them, that you must do them, you would regard as absurd unless you admitted to a higher will to which yours was subject. The existence of this sovereign power is frequently a matter of doubt or even of denial to the one who is a vaunter of deeds and a contemner of creeds. Formally or virtually, he is an atheist or an agnostic. What or how much do you believe? We would ask the indifferentist concerning the existence of a God who has brought you into being and has a claim on your obedience. And what bearing do you suppose obedience to God has upon one's eternal destiny? You have drawn up a brief list of essential duties. What if obedience to God requires you to extend the list? Whatever be the present state of your mind regarding that subject, the question is one of tremendous importance to you personally. Your eternal destiny must far outweigh any possible amount of difficulty involved in a search for light on the subject. If the duty of knowing and serving God were but a fancy engendered in weak and ignorant minds, it might be set aside as undeserving of attention. But if the brightest and noblest minds in history have accepted it and acted upon it, it surely possesses a special claim to your attention. Even though it had no such high recommendation, the fact that eternity is at stake should be enough to induce you to make an honest inquiry after the truth. Such an inquiry need not be a hopeless one. It is not a matter of traveling into some unknown region of speculation in which there are no landmarks for the guidance of the traveler. These 1900 years a power has been at work in this world which has wrought for the ennobling, elevating and purifying of the human soul, and which bears upon it the seal of its divine origin. Impeded in its action at times by the human instrument which it must employ, nevertheless by reason of the divine element in it, it has won its way to human hearts and has gradually embraced the greater part of the world within the sphere of its influence. Christianity is the first subject to be studied by anyone who is setting about a search for the truth, the more so as Christianity has sprung from and is the perfecting of the oldest, the most consistent, the noblest tradition of religious teaching in the history of the world, that of the chosen people of God. Toglie et lege. Take up the book of the Gospels, as the angel said to St. Augustine, whose giant intellect was for a time held captive by one of the false philosophies of his day. Read with the unbiased mind of an Augustine, and pray with but 1/10 of his fervor, and sooner or later light will succeed darkness. We have been thinking in the above passage of the type of indifferentist who makes light of all religious knowledge, who knows nothing and cares to know nothing about God, revelation, or immortality. But there is one of another type who is something of a Christian and who respects the authority of Christ and the Bible. Bred in childhood to the teaching of one or other of the Christian sects, he has allowed the cares or the pleasures of the world to draw him away from religious worship, or it may be he attends religious services intermittently, though he brings to them a set of Christian or half-Christian beliefs of his own making. In either case, when the claims of the one true religion are urged, he takes refuge behind a sort of half-conviction that after all it matters little which of the creeds he adopts, provided his deeds are in harmony with the Christian code, whatever that may mean to him. An indifferentist of this class should be reminded that the first and foremost of those good deeds of which he makes so much account is to believe, and believe in its totality what Christ has revealed, and what he has enjoined upon all to believe. That revelation is one and unchangeable, and constitutes a definite body of teachings placed in the keeping of a church, one only church, which is the pillar and ground of truth, against which the gates of hell shall not prevail, those teachers the promise was given, "Behold, I am with you all days, even to the consummation of the world." That this definite teaching of a visible church must be accepted by all is plain from the words of Christ. "Go ye into the whole world, and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be condemned. Or as the Protestant Authorized Version has it, shall be damned." If a rejection of Christ's teaching deserves eternal damnation, an indifference to all creeds must deserve the same penalty. Therefore, an effort to find the one true creed is an imperative duty. "But," replies the indifferentist, "as things are today, how is it possible to discover the true faith of Christ? Must I examine the claims of 700 sects, each asserting its own exclusive possession of the truth?" The difficulty you fear is in the first place exaggerated. Yet even if it were much greater than it is, the importance of the object of your quest would far outweigh the difficulty involved in searching for it. It is a matter of obtaining the pearl of great price and of providing for eternity. If you were given 700 keys of all shapes, and were told that one of them, by a certain number of turns to the right and left, would unlock the door of an apartment containing untold treasures, all of which would be yours if you lighted on the right key and discovered how to use it, would you not spend whole days, nay even months and years, searching for the right key and applying it to the lock? Most men would, and not unreasonably, for the treasure would be worth the trouble. But the search for the truth is not so intricate a nature. It is true that but one of the 700 keys is the right one. But there are ways of simplifying the search. There are tests that may be applied, by means of which you may in a short time eliminate all but the right key. By the use of these tests, countless inquirers have, as a matter of fact, been led to the truth. Some have applied to the various Christian sects the historical test or that of origin. The church that could trace its history back to the apostles must have superior claims to those churches that have existed only a few centuries, and which were repudiated and cut off from communion by the church, which has undoubtedly existed since the time of the apostles. Others have applied the test of universality. The Church of Christ must be a world church. It must be confined to no single country or race, and above all, must not derive all its authority from the secular government of any particular country. But there is one test which is perhaps the most obvious and the most easily applied: the test of unity, and to this we would ask the special attention of the indifferentist. It needs but little reflection to see that unity should be one of the chief attributes of the Church to which Christ committed the preaching of the Word. In the first place, the doctrine he commanded it to preach was to be one and unchanged forever. This, from the nature of the case, should be obvious. No one, not even an angel from heaven, St. Paul admonishes us, was authorized to change it. It is no less clear that perfect agreement should subsist among those who accepted the teaching of the apostles. Otherwise, it would have been useless for one only doctrine to have been preached to all. Moreover, oneness of doctrine was to be rooted in oneness of authority, the divinely constituted teaching authority of the Church. Our Lord did not simply exhort his followers to unity of doctrine, but gave them a body of accredited teachers who were to go forth, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. He that believeth you and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. He that heareth you heareth me. He that despiseth you despiseth me. If he will not hear the church, let him be to thee as the heathen and the publican. Such is the visible teaching authority established by Christ. This and no other can be the source of all right doctrine, and consequently of all unity of doctrine in the Church. In any church professing to be Christian and yet not teaching with authority, unity of doctrine is left to chance, or rather is exposed to certain disruption. The Jews said of our Lord that he spoke as one having authority, and not as the scribes and the Pharisees. And a consciousness of divine authority showed itself in every word he uttered. The same note of authority rang through the discourse of St. Peter on the day of Pentecost. No less authoritative were the utterances of the Apostle of the Gentiles. And if there is a church today that perpetuates the mission of Christ and his apostles, its teaching must bear the same stamp of authority. Oneness of doctrine and oneness of authority are therefore a characteristic note of the true Church of Christ. Take unity as your criterion, we would say to the indifferentist, and you will find that the problem of finding the one Church of Christ is rendered comparatively easy. Your 700 religions will at once resolve themselves into two classes: those that possess unity and those that do not. In the first class you will find the Catholic Church and no other. Catholic and Roman Catholic are the same. The unity of the Catholic Church is so conspicuous as to force itself on the notice and excite the jealousy of its enemies. Every single Catholic in a grand total of nearly 300 million believes the same doctrine as every other member of the Church. True, in matters that have not been defined as of faith, considerable latitude is permitted to personal opinion, and on these points there has been divergence of opinion. But on the other hand, there is a tribunal which is competent to decide, in the first place, what is of faith and what is not, and in the second place, which of the parties to a controversy is in the right. The unity of the Church consists then in the universal acceptance of what is taught as of faith, and the readiness to accept the decision of the Church in matters of controversy. With human minds constituted as they are, this is the most perfect unity conceivable, and indeed, there is no parallel to it in human society. Outside the Catholic Church, we find enormous number of sects all bearing the name of Christian. Taken as a body, and to a great extent taken singly, these Christian sects are confessedly and notoriously disunited. Their one common ground is their opposition to the only church that possesses unity. Even the Bible, which has always been the one rule of faith, has fallen from its once high place in their estimation and is gradually sinking to the rank of an ordinary history containing a large admixture of the mythical. All the world knows that many of the leading lights of Protestantism deal with the Bible in a purely rationalistic spirit. But even when the Bible ruled supreme, it was the very fountain source of disunion, for it was on the alleged authority of the Bible that every new dissenting sect based its separation from the older ones. This tendency to disunion has been the most striking trait of Protestantism from the beginning. Not even the potent influence of such characters as Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli could reduce their followers to unity. Seeing, however, that their teachings must be backed by an assertion of authority, they ruled the conduct and consciences of their subjects with a rod of iron. But private judgment was not to be stifled. Who is this Luther? Who Calvin? Who Zwingli? Are we not as good interpreters of the Bible as they? So queried their followers, and hence the numerous divisions that sprang up even during the infancy of Protestantism. It is of great importance, wrote Calvin to Melanchthon, that the divisions that subsist among us should not be known to future ages. For nothing can be more ridiculous than that we, who have been compelled to make a separation from the whole world, should have agreed so ill among ourselves from the beginning of the Reformation. Melanchthon wrote in answer that the Elbe, with all its waters, could not furnish tears enough to weep over the miseries of the distracted Reformation. Beza makes moan in a similar strain. Our people, he says, are carried away by every wind of doctrine. If you know what their religion is today, you cannot tell what it may be tomorrow. There is not a single point which is not held by some of them as an article of faith, and by others rejected as an impiety. Each individual is a free and fully authorized judge of all those who wish to instruct him, and each one is taught by God alone. The divisions of Protestantism have not been healed by time. It is no paradox to say that disintegration is the law of its being. Temporary union is the result of the accidents of time and place. Where everyone may think as he pleases, there may be as many religions as there are heads to invent them. We have endeavored to furnish the indifferentist a clue that may lead him out of the labyrinth into which he has been driven by the sight of the multitudinous sects whose claims are so confused and so confusing. The clue we offer him is neither new nor untried, for it has been used by many in the same situation. Moreover, testimony of the strongest kind has been rendered in its favor by a class of thinkers who, though not embracing the truth themselves, have lost nothing of their logical acumen. It is a well-known position of many unbelievers of the skeptical and critical schools that if Christianity were true, there would be no choice for them between Roman Catholicism and any other form of Christianity. Unity and consistency are naturally looked for by logical minds in the teaching of a God-man and his true representatives. The strength of this testimony lies in the fact of its coming from so independent a source. For anyone who is convinced by the above reasoning, there is but one practical course open. He should seek instruction in Catholic doctrine.
Indulgences. Erroneous views. 1. Indulgences are an easy means of obtaining pardon for sin, even future sin, without repentance. They have been applied to the releasing of souls from purgatory, and for that purpose they might be bought for money. 2. In theory, indulgences always presupposed repentance, but as the business was managed in Germany before the Reformation, it amounted in the popular apprehension to a sale of absolution from guilt, or to the ransom of deceased friends from purgatory for money. Fisher, Outlines of Universal History, page 397. The truth. An indulgence is neither a pardon for sin nor a license to commit sin. It supposes repentance for sin. In this matter, the practical belief of Catholics has never been at variance with the theory as set forth by Catholic theologians. Old prejudices die hard, especially in matters religious, but the collapse of the old prejudice against indulgences has already begun. The two sets of objections placed at the head of this article, which are not in entire agreement, are intended to exhibit the turn of the tide of popular opinion regarding indulgences. Our opponents are gradually getting nearer the truth. The author of a popular textbook informs us that indulgences are not, in theory, a pardon for sin, but that the people of Germany once thought they were and bought them as such. Let us hope that the editor of some future edition of the book will advance a step further and tell his readers that indulgences neither are nor have thought to be anything but remission of temporal punishment after repentance. What is meant by an indulgence? An indulgence is the remission or canceling of the temporal punishment due to sin after the sin itself has been forgiven. The punishment is to be suffered either in this life or the next. In this life, it may take the form either of voluntary penance or of penance enjoined by the Church. It supposes sincere repentance for sin, and in many cases is given only on condition of contrite confession. Such is the technical and ecclesiastical meaning of the word indulgence. It differs somewhat from its ordinary meaning. In common parlance, it means an easy, yielding, and forbearing disposition toward those who are subject to us, and does not necessarily imply repentance or atonement for offenses committed. In ecclesiastical usage, it signifies a favor granted to those who are already friends of God by the possession of sanctifying grace. A soul stained by grievous sin must first be reconciled with God before receiving any such favors at the hands of the Church. The definition we have given implies that even when God forgives sin, there may still be some atonement to be made for it. The idea is not a familiar one to persons outside the Catholic Church, but it is nonetheless scriptural. Moses, though a friend of God and forgiven his transgression, was nevertheless punished by not being permitted to enter the promised land. David was pardoned by the Lord for his double crime of adultery and murder. The Lord also hath taken away thy sin, the prophet Nathan told him. Nevertheless, he added, because thou hast given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, for this thing the child that is born to thee shall surely die. A plain case of punishment inflicted after the forgiveness of the sin. Now it is precisely the canceling of such punishment that is meant by an indulgence. But is it possible that the Church has it in her power to release the sinner from such atonement for his sin? Such power has undoubtedly been conferred upon the Church. The idea of a Church that wields the power of the keys has unfortunately faded away from the minds of our separated brethren, and yet it stands out in strong relief upon the pages of Scripture. Whatsoever thou shalt loose upon the earth, it shall be loosed in heaven. Matthew chapter 16, verse 19. These words were addressed to Peter, but the same powers were afterward conferred on all the apostles. Matthew chapter 18, verse 18. By reason of their generality, we must understand these words to refer to every bond or obstacle which bars heaven against the faithful, consequently to the outstanding temporal punishment of sin. Even greater power than this was given the apostles. Whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven them. John chapter 20, verse 23. What wonder, then, if possessing a power that can open or close the gates of heaven to sinners for all eternity, they should possess the lesser power of retaining or remitting the mere temporal punishment due to sin. Objection. The remission of such temporal punishment by indulgences should be a comparatively rare occurrence and should not be granted on such easy terms as they are in the Church in Rome. Punishment becomes a byword when it is frequently canceled on merciful considerations. Answer. Indulgences are frequently given, it is true, but not on such easy terms as fancied. Some of the smaller indulgences are granted for the recitation of short prayers, but the greater the indulgence, the greater the exaction. In all cases, good works of one kind or another are enjoined, such as fasting, almsgiving, confession, communion, visits to churches, pilgrimages, and the like. But even supposing that all indulgences were granted on the easiest possible conditions, it must be remembered that, though punishment is demanded by justice and may be salutary to the penitent, nevertheless there may be something better than a punishment. A prudent parent will easily cancel a child's punishment when such indulgence will lead to the child's improvement. Now there is one thing the Church never loses sight of in granting indulgences: the spiritual good of those who receive them. As a matter of fact, the discipline of indulgences produces a great increase of piety among the faithful. The good works required bring the sinner nearer to God. Prayer, confession of sins, the receiving of the bread of life, anticipate the salutary effects of punishment and render the soul more pleasing to God. The power conferred on the apostles, and consequently on their successors, was exercised by them from the beginning of the history of the Church. Witness St. Paul's treatment of the incestuous Corinthian, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verses 3 to 5 and 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verses 6 and 7. In the name and by the power of Jesus Christ he punishes the sinner, but afterward, as repenting the person of Christ, he remits the punishment. The binding and the loosing were evidently regarded by St. Paul as ratified in heaven. In the early days of the Church, it was customary to impose severe public penances for the more grievous offenses. These canonical penances might last for years. They were intended partly as an expiation for sins committed, and on account of their being imposed by the binding powers of the Church, they were regarded as though imposed by God himself. and when the Church exercised her power of loosing by remitting a portion of the punishment, or, in other words, granted an indulgence, the punishment was believed to have been cancelled by God himself. The power of binding and loosing given by God would be recognized by him in its actual exercise. In times of persecution, those who were imprisoned for the faith, especially those who were about to suffer martyrdom, could obtain for well-disposed penitents a shortening of their terms of canonical penance. St. Cyprian bears express testimony to the belief that such favors bestowed by the Church were ratified by God. In one of his epistles, he expresses confidence in the belief that sinners who are on their deathbeds and have not had time to complete their canonical penances are helped before God and will come to him in peace, in consequence of the indulgences of the Church granted at the solicitation of the martyrs. These writings generally, of St. Cyprian, Tertullian, and many other authorities of the first 5 centuries, throw a clear light upon the belief and practice of the early Church in the matter of indulgences. Both the belief and the practice were the same then as they are today. As to the application of indulgences to the souls in purgatory, it must be noted that the Church lays no claim to jurisdiction over the souls in the other life. Hence, if indulgences are applied to the souls of the dead, it is only per modum suffragii, i.e., by way of petition. The Church presents her offering or ransom to the Almighty, and it is doubtless accepted, though we cannot know with certainty how much any particular soul is benefited by it. And now a word or two about the abuses, real and imaginary, in the actual administration of indulgences, out of which the adversaries of the Catholic faith have made so much capital, especially the alleged traffic in indulgences which roused Luther's ire and was the immediate occasion of his onslaught upon the Church. In the first place, there is nothing too sacred to be free from abuse, but the abuse of a good thing furnishes no argument against its proper use. Just before Luther's revolt, there were undoubtedly some abuses connected with the preaching of a notable indulgence published by Pope Leo X, but they were committed contrary to the explicit instructions of ecclesiastical superiors, and they were condemned in that day, as they are condemned today, by all right-minded Catholics. But, granting that there were certain extravagances attending the preaching of this indulgence, we must deny that they were such as to justify the sweeping assertions placed at the head of this article, and yet these are typical of the attacks made upon Catholic doctrine and practice. Recent historians have thrown some light upon the facts of the case. In the year 1514, Pope Leo X published an indulgence to aid in the completing of St. Peter's Church in Rome. It was to be gained partly by the performance of some of the usual good works, confession, communion, and a fast. But the well-to-do were to add an alms for completion of the church, while the poor, instead of giving an alms, were to say extra prayers. The indulgence obtained under the grant might be applied, or transferred, to the souls in purgatory. There is nothing absurd or unchristian in supposing that God deigns to have regard to good works, including almsgiving, performed for the benefit of souls in the other life. Only we cannot know, as we have said, whether or how much any particular soul is benefited by such acts. Nevertheless, there was at that time an opinion held by some theologians that a plenary indulgence applied to a particular soul was certain to release it from the fires of purgatory. It is easy to imagine how a doctrine like this might be exploited by a zealous preacher whose heart was set upon large money returns. That it was so exploited, at least by some and to a certain extent, we must frankly admit as a historical fact, though we are not bound to accept the traditional Protestant account of the matter, which is inspired by prejudice against the Church. For well-nigh 4 centuries, Protestants have made merry over real or imaginary extravagances in the preaching of indulgences in the 16th century. Why, in the name of justice, why this constant taunting of us Catholics for such religious abuses of the Middle Ages? Why the constant endeavor to shame us and our Catholic ancestors? Were they not equally the ancestors of our Protestant antagonists? And do not we as well as our separated brethren condemn these abuses? The real difference between our Protestant friends and ourselves is that we have discarded the abuses but clung to the old faith, while they have rejected all in the lump. The fact of primary importance is that no abuse connected with indulgences in the 16th century, or indeed any century, ever met with the approval of the Church, and that every such abuse was visited with express condemnation. The utterances of Cardinal Cajetan, says Jansen, prove that the sentiments of the preachers in question were not those of Rome. The preachers, says Cajetan, came forward in the name of the Church in so far as they proclaim the teaching of Christ and the Church. But if they teach out of their own heads and for their own profit, things about which they have no knowledge, they cannot pass as representatives of the Church, and one cannot wonder that in such cases they fall into error. And yet it was such accidental abuses, which never had the Church's approval, that furnished a pretext for the unspeakable scandal of a revolt against the Church itself by the founder of Protestantism. Efforts to correct the abuses in question had been made before Luther's time. The Church ultimately succeeded, as only the true Church can succeed, in ridding itself of any such ugly excrescence. The Catholic Church is indeed the only religious body possessing the power of correcting abuses within its pale without disrupting itself. It is not true, then, that indulgences are an easy mean of obtaining pardon for sin. They have nothing to do with the guilt of sin, and the remission of temporal punishment due to sin cannot be obtained except by the contrite of heart. As to the statement that at least in the popular estimation indulgences were a sale of absolution from guilt, such assertions are easily made, but where is the proof? When was there a time in the history of the Church when the essential conditions for obtaining specific indulgences were not clearly set forth in official documents addressed to the multitude? These conditions always included interior dispositions, especially sorrow for sin. As to the alleged popular persuasion that particular souls in purgatory could be ransomed by money, is the possible effect upon the ignorant of indiscreet preaching by a certain class of preachers on a certain occasion to be erected into evidence of a general popular perversion of belief?
Jesus of Nazareth, his existence. A bold assertion. It is not historically certain that Christ ever existed, and yet the whole of Christianity is based on the life of Christ. The answer. Is there another personage in history whose existence is so well vouched for as that of Christ? As well might Caesar, or Cicero, or even Frederick the Great, or Napoleon be regarded as mythical, for the existence of these historical characters is not more authentically established than that of Christ. Clear and positive testimony of the life and work of Christ is found in the writings of those who were almost his contemporaries, such as Suetonius, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger. It is found even in the writings of the eminent Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus. But there is not the smallest need of going beyond the four Gospels for a complete authentication of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. If the four Gospels are pure fiction, the production of such a piece of fiction was a miracle of the first order. There is nothing in the creative genius of man that could ever have reached such an altitude of conception or of execution. And yet in the Gospels we have four distinct portraits of a man of transcendent greatness, differing in detail, yet each bearing unmistakable signs of being true to the life. And then what strong sidelights are thrown upon the Gospels by the other books of the New Testament. To think that this whole mass of writings, almost contemporaneous with the life of him who is their one great subject, should be occupied with a purely imaginary character, is to be capable of harboring in one's mind the veriest of chimeras. Read the New Testament, we would say to anyone who is disposed to regard the history of Christ as a myth. Read the New Testament, or at least the four Gospels, from beginning to end, and then ask yourself honestly whether you can reasonably doubt of the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, the founder of the Christian religion. It is perfectly true that the whole of Christianity is based on the life of Christ. It is not less the truth that Christianity has been an undoubted factor, and one of stupendous importance, in the making of the world's history these 1900 years. Now, to attempt to explain the existence of Christianity without the existence of Christ would be folly no less pronounced than to attempt to build a house by beginning at the roof. Christianity did not simply drop from the clouds. It owes its origin to a personage who trode the earth and moved among men. No mere product of human fancy could impress his own image on the work of his hands as Christ impressed his upon the religion he founded. No imaginary character could have inspired thousands to suffer frightful torments, and even lay down their lives, solely for his sake. No, Christ was no myth. He lived, preached, and wrought miracles in what is now the Holy Land. He was crucified at the demand of the Jews. On the third day after his death he rose from his tomb. These facts are so well established that no one, unless he closes his eyes, can fail to see them. Christ, moreover, was the eternal Son of God. Therefore Christianity rests for support on the incarnate life of God himself. See Christ's divinity.
Justification. Lutheran view. The doctrine of justification by faith alone is the new experience of salvation. Hellserfahrung, first enjoyed by Luther and then transmitted to the Church. Leimbach's Hilfbuch. The Catholic doctrine. A Catholic reader might easily conclude from the above quotation that if this salvation experience was first felt by Luther, Christ and the apostles must have known nothing about it. But Herr Leimbach has a theory about the history of this Protestant doctrine of justification. He informs us that the Church, even in the early days of its history, fell into error and ceased to teach the doctrine about the appropriating of salvation. If that be the case, we can only say that Christ failed to guard his Church from error, despite the fact that he had promised to enlighten it through the teaching of the Holy Spirit. When he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will teach you all truth. John 16:13. In giving his apostles their commission to preach, he said to them, "Going therefore, teach ye all nations, teaching them to observe all things, whatsoever I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you all days, even to the consummation of the world." Matthew 28:19-20. He sends them forth to teach and promises to be with them. But how with them except by aiding them in their work and preserving their teaching from error? And the aid he promised them was to endure to the end of the world. The common evangelical position is that we are justified without any merit of ours and by faith alone, whilst according to Catholic teaching, we are justified by faith and by good works. The evangelical doctrine has no warrant in Scripture. The phrase "by faith alone" does indeed occur in Luther's translation of the Bible, Romans 3:28. But it is not in the original text and was inserted by Luther. The Catholic Church teaches and has always taught that we must distinguish between a living and a dead faith. A living faith, faith animated by charity, justifies, whilst a dead faith, or a mere believing in the truth taught, does not justify. If Luther meant a dead faith, he was in error. If he meant a living faith, he had no reason, so far as justification went, for separating from the Church. Even if Luther meant by faith the act of believing what is revealed, coupled with a confident surrendering of the soul to God and his grace, neither is this sort of faith a living faith, nor can it produce justification. St. James expressly tells us that even as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. By works is meant the observance of the commandments, and the observance of the commandments is not a mere act of confidence of any sort. If since the Augsburg Confession of 1530 the Reformers have emphasised the necessity of good works also, as springing from the true faith, then, again, the Reformation had no reason for existing. If we are obliged, 1. to believe what God has revealed, 2. to trust in the grace of Christ, 3. to love God, which implies the observance of his commandments, This is precisely what the Catholic Church required of its members long before the Reformation, and it is what it requires today. Each and all of the commandments must be fulfilled if we would be saved. As to the text of Romans 3:28, for we account a man to be justified by faith without the works of the law, very little need be said to set it in its true light. In the first place, the word alone, which Luther introduces after the word faith, is in some sense implied by the context. But Luther had no right to insert it, as it would be misleading, for he misinterprets both the word faith and the phrase works of the law. By works of the law, St. Paul means the works of the Mosaic law, circumcision, bloody sacrifices, and the like. By faith, he means a living faith, which necessarily includes the observance of God's commandments or good works. As Christians since Luther's time have been disputing with one another on the question, how is the sinner justified before God? And as each of the numerous parties in the strife appeals to Scripture for proof of its position, the question naturally arises: whom has God appointed to settle so vital a question? The answer can be no other than this: questions of doctrine are to be settled by the Church established by Christ, by the Church which he commissioned to preach the truth, the Church which is the pillar and ground of truth. He that heareth you heareth me, and he that despiseth you despiseth me, and he that despiseth me despiseth him that sent me. Go ye into the whole world, and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be condemned. Peter and the other apostles were the teaching body appointed by Christ. So long as Protestants fail not to understand, but to realise this truth, and fail to recognise in the successors of Peter and the apostles the inheritors of the teaching office in the Church, so long will it be impossible for our separated brethren and us to come to an agreement on other questions. Where the Bible does not decide a question, there yet remains a tribunal that can decide it. A part of that Bible to which Protestants appeal as to a final arbiter in questions of faith, the New Testament, is a creation of the Church, and owes its existence to the teaching office of the Church. It is indeed the work of God, but God, as inspiring the teachers of the Church, and the inspiration that guided the Church as to what it should teach in script, must be supposed to guide the Church in its interpretation of what it has written. Hence it is often quite unprofitable to dispute with Protestants on such questions as justification, the sacrifice of the Mass, the veneration of saints, purgatory, indulgences, celibacy. The paramount question is this: where is that teaching authority whose utterances must have no uncertain ring, but must be a certain guide to salvation, and must be listened to and obeyed? Where is that Church which was founded on Peter, the Church which is the pillar and ground of truth? If that question remains unsettled, it is difficult, for the most part, to arrive at a solution of others. Once it is settled, I have an infallible guide on the subject of purgatory, indulgences, and other points of controversy. The Church must be infallible, since I have Christ's command to believe it and obey it. Now the Catholic Church is the only Church that even lays claim to possessing such infallible authority. Therefore, the Catholic Church is the only one whose teaching can be accepted as authoritative and as decisive in matters of controversy.
Labor unions. A false principle. Strikes, boycotts, and other such expedients employed by labor unions are the only weapons they can wield in their defense, Why may they not be used in the most effective way possible? In time of war, one cannot be over-nice in his choice of means to attain his end. The truth. We're not going to write a dissertation on labor unions. We are only anxious to guard our working men against pernicious principles which are not always enunciated as plainly or as boldly as they are above, but which are nevertheless embodied in outward acts. There is danger of all democratic movements of our day being guided by the principle that everything is right that succeeds, that the great thing is to get there, no matter by what way. But there is a right and a wrong way in collective action, as well as in individual action, and fundamentally, both are to be governed by the same moral principles. Strikes. The assumption that there is a state of real warfare between employers and employed is unfortunately in our day an actual factor in the working out of the problems of industrial life, so that we are dealing here with no chimera. When a strike is ordered, it is often taken for granted that the strikers are at liberty to do pretty much as an army does in invading hostile territory, and yet not even the laws of civilized warfare are observed. No laws of any kind govern the action of a mass of men whose principle is get what you can, no matter how. A strike is not a war. A war is the extremest of measures used to attain human ends. Violence is its very essence. Its immediate aim is to kill, capture, or starve as many of the enemy as possible. Nothing can justify it but an evil threatened or endured as great or greater than the evil inflicted by the war. Now, in the judgment of saner minds, the present posture of affairs does not justify anything in the nature of strict warfare. Even on a small scale, the classes are not separated by any line of demarcation that places them in opposite camps. The working man has sincere friends in the higher classes. The real grievances, such as they are, result from conditions that cannot be changed in a hurry. Pacific methods have wrought all the beneficial changes that have affected working men, and although there is still a great deal to mend in the present situation, working men as a body have made steady progress in bettering their condition. It is not, therefore, or at least should not be, a matter of two opposing forces, each bent on the destruction of the other. The fact is that each of the two classes is indispensable to the other. Socialists have dreams of a state of things in which all distinction of classes will be abolished, but as the reader may see from other parts of this book, they are no more than dreams. A strike has in it, of course, an element of hostility. Harm is done to the employer, and harm is intended. It is through the harm done to his business by the strike that the strikers hope to compel him to be just. Nevertheless, though harm is done and intended, a strike is justifiable under certain conditions. Justice forbids me to do harm to my fellow man, but justice to myself may sometimes warrant me in coercing my fellow man into being just in his dealings with me. What form and what measure of coercion I am allowed to use must depend on circumstances. Reckless violence can never be permitted. Violence of any kind or degree should be the very last resort. In cases in which coercion is needful and allowable, a strike is regarded with favor by the moralist for the following reasons. 1. It is the form of coercion furthest removed from turbulence and anarchy. 2. It is, after all, only the exercise of the workingman's natural right to work or to refuse to work for any particular employer. But let us not be misunderstood on this point. From a moral point of view, there is, of course, a great difference between the case of a single workman withdrawing from the service of any particular employer, and that of a combination of workmen doing the same. In the first case, at least ordinarily, no harm is done the employer, and the workman exercises his natural right. But the combination inflicts an injury, and the injury is intended, though presumably not for its own sake. And although each member of the combination has a natural right to leave the service of his employer, he has no right of any kind to conspire with others in the adoption of a measure entailing injury to his employer, unless the common grievance of the workman outweighs the right of the employer to the peaceful pursuit of his calling. In a just strike, the grievance of the employees has, as a matter of fact, such preponderating importance, and hence it justifies the working men in availing themselves of their natural right. A strike may be just or unjust, and it is just only when it is in harmony with the common laws of morality. The chief part of the responsibility for unjust strikes rests with those who issue orders for them in the labor unions, but the men of the rank and file are not machines. They have minds of their own and consciences of their own, and the moral law forbids them to pay blind obedience to orders on the pretext that the responsibility is not theirs but their officers. The following rules should be carefully kept in mind. 1. A strike should not be resorted to when milder expedients are available. Arbitration is a means of settlement that has been successful in many cases. Why can it not be so in all cases? Things have come to a strange pass when the decision of 3, 5, or 7 men chosen as arbiters by the mutual consent of the contending parties cannot be trusted. A refusal to accept arbitration usually gives rise to the suspicion that the party refusing has little reliance on the justice of its cause and is determined to impose its will on the other party. 2. The demands of the strikers should be reasonable. When wages are unreasonably low, when negotiations on the subject have resulted in nothing, and when more pacific measures are not within reach, a strike would ordinarily be justifiable. When wages are reasonably high, and especially when they procure for the working man some of the comforts of life, a strike would very seldom be justifiable. It is often difficult to decide in particular cases whether or not wages are unreasonably low, but surely the principle would be a false one that should hold the working man down to a wage that secures for him only the bare necessities of life. Every manual laborer is entitled to a moderate share in the simplest comforts of life, and should be able to lay aside a little for a rainy day. Hence any refusal of wages necessary for the procuring of these advantages would justify a strike, unless of course other circumstances in the case forbade one. The same rule applies to the demand for shorter hours of work. To have to toil the livelong day is unreasonable. The working man is entitled to a moderate amount of leisure. How much can or ought to be allowed him must depend on circumstances. There can be no fixed rule, and the insistence on a fixed rule, especially for all working men, irrespective of circumstances, may easily be unjust to employers. A demand for 8 hours daily labor for all classes of workingmen is probably quite arbitrary. 3. Strike should not be accompanied by violence or by any form of physical coercion. When violence is added to abstention from labor, a strike ceases to be a strike. It becomes a state of war. If even a peaceful strike can be resorted to only for grave reasons, the added element of violence and disorder, including, as it does, injury to person and property, can be justified only by exceptionally grave reasons. Under ordinary circumstances, the use of destructive violence, even on a small scale, is not allowable. Even the milder forms of personal violence or coercion, such as the preventing of a non-striker from entering the workshop, or the driving him from his work, are an invasion of personal liberty which can rarely be justified and should rarely occur. There may be cases in which the non-striker acts a very selfish part and is bound in charity to cooperate with the strikers, but the latter are as a rule bound to respect his independence. The necessities of his family may oblige him to work, or he may have conscientious scruples about engaging in the strike, but in anything like ordinary circumstances, he has a right to decide whether he shall work or not, and it would take a very strong reason, based on the common good, to justify his being coerced into abstention from work. 4. Probability of success is necessary for the justification of a strike. It stands to reason that when the chances are considerably against the success of a strike, a measure entailing so much loss to employer and employed cannot be defended. 5. A sympathetic strike is less easily justified than a primary one. A sympathetic strike is one in which the strikers have no grievance of their own, but quit work in order to help on a strike by another set of workmen, either under the same or under another employer. If sympathetic strikes are defended on the principle that a man may help his fellow man in their just contests, it must be remembered that helping the oppressed is one thing, injuring the innocent another. If I help A against B, who is injuring him, it does not follow that I can injure C, who is not concerned in the affair. In some cases it would be lawful for one class or set of workmen to help by a sympathetic strike another set or class of workmen in the same establishment engaged in a just strike. For if the strike is just in the case of the primary workers, their grievance may be taken up by their sympathizers. But it is very difficult to find a reason justifying a strike directed against an employer who is fair in his dealings with his own workmen. The fact that he furnishes material to an employer against whom a just strike is being maintained is not a sufficient reason for a strike, except in those very rare cases in which charity would oblige him to help the oppressed to his own detriment, and in which pressure might be brought to bear upon him to bring him to a sense of his duty. Boycotts. The moral bearings of boycotts are much the same as those of strikes. A boycott is an agreement among several or many to abstain from dealing with a person in business or from having intercourse with him in professional or social life. As it consists in simple abstention, but yet entails an injury, it falls under the same moral rules as the strike. It is rarely allowable, and all the more rarely as the common good is seriously threatened by the tendency to anarchy begotten by such practices. The secondary boycott, as it is called, is less rarely justified than the primary or ordinary boycott. It is directed against one who refuses to break off intercourse with a person who is primarily boycotted, against a tradesman, for instance, who continues to supply material for manufacture to an establishment that is under a boycott. The secondary boycott is an invasion of personal liberty which none but the very gravest reasons can justify. A practice akin to boycotting is the refusal of union men to work in the same shop as non-union men. It is a restriction of the opportunities of non-union working men which it takes a great deal to justify. Ordinarily, no one is obliged to join a labor union, and there may be cases in which conscience forbids, and although the union may be considerably hampered by the fact that non-union men are very numerous, the interests and principles of the latter are nevertheless to be respected. There may possibly be very exceptional cases in which all working men in one trade are in duty bound to join the labor union, but they are not the ordinary cases. The dictation of how many apprentices shall be employed in one establishment has the same moral bearings as most of the other practices of unionists. An overplus of apprentices may be an evil, but it is one that must be borne with, except when it has reached the extreme of severity. The opportunities of those who aspire to learning an honorable trade must not be restricted without any great necessity. Attempts to limit the output of individual workmen in a manufactory can be excused only under exceptional circumstances. The injuring of machinery and the destruction of goods is a piece of barbarism which all civilized unionists ought to endeavor to block out of industrial life. In the course of these remarks, it must be evident to every reader that we have not condemned without any discrimination the practices of strikers and boycotters. The more weighty the grievance, and the more removed the tactics from injustice and barbarism, the more easily is the use of so extreme a measure as a strike or a boycott allowed. The cause for which strikers or boycotters contend in any particular case may be a just one, and a strike or a boycott may be the only available means of contending for it. But who will decide the justice of the cause or the rectitude of the methods employed? Even the trained moralist and the expert in economics would often find it difficult to decide whether a strike was justifiable. Shall then the decision be entrusted to the untrained judgments of a promiscuous mass of workingmen who are all interested parties and who are not disposed to enter into the views of their opponents? And is it not well known that some of the leaders in such affairs are indifferent to the methods they adopt, and consider that all is grist that comes to their mill? These considerations should make it evident that, although in the abstract a strike may be a perfectly lawful procedure, strikes in the concrete should be looked at askance, seeing that they foster such pernicious tendencies and occasion so much material loss. Hence it is the duty of the citizens of a country to do all in their power to get rid of strikes, boycotts, and the tyrannous element in labor union procedure. Direct government legislation in the matter of the minimum wage, or of the maximum price of commodities, or of the length of a laborer's workday, may be considered by some as a last resort in any country of acknowledged free institutions, but things are drifting in that precise direction, and we, for our part, cannot see the unwisdom of subjecting such legislation to the test of experience. Little or no objection can be urged against indirect legislation, such, for instance, as would oblige the parties in a dispute to submit their case to arbitration and abide by the decision given. Strikes contain a comment on the times which every man of reflection should take to heart. Sharp opposition between the classes is rooted partly, it is true, in the conditions of social and industrial life, but it is no less deeply rooted in the perverse tendencies of the classes themselves. Ultra-democracy on the one side and ultra-aristocracy on the other, both aggravated by the rapid decrease of religious influence, are accountable, at least for the fact that the mutual opposition of the classes has reached so acute a stage, and it is only by a reversal of these conditions that things can be thoroughly and permanently righted. We do not despair of the power of governments to mitigate the social distemper, but governmental remedies rarely go to the heart of such diseases. Each of the two great classes must be taught, by every means available, its own proper ideals, and this education of the classes must be begun in the schoolroom and at the altar. Writers of our day frequently point to the guilds of the Middle Ages as teaching an object lesson on the conditions of labor and the relations between employers and employed, but writers and readers alike should remember that the guilds were religious to the core, and that religious charity was the ultimate principle of their inner life and of their external influence.
Latin in the Liturgy. Objection. Why use Latin in the Liturgy? Why may not English-speaking nations use their own language, as the Greeks and Syrians used theirs? Latin is a strange tongue to the vast majority of worshippers. The answer. The Catholic Church is not a national church, it is a church for all nations under the sun. Universality is one of the marks by which it is distinguished from all other churches bearing the name of Christian. Hence, a universal language is necessary in its public worship. In modern business life, the absence of a universal language is much deplored, and various attempts have been made to invent one. For the Catholic Church, in which the necessity of such a language is much more urgent, a universal language has been providentially supplied. The possession of a common language is essential not to the existence of the Church, but to its well-being. Let us try to realize what this means in the actual life of the Church. In the first place, the words of the Mass are fixed, stereotyped, and in the more essential parts of the Mass are as ancient as the Church itself. They remain unchanged because they are so intimately connected with the unchangeable sacrifice. Now, the greater the tendency to multiply vernacular versions, the greater the danger of departing from the meaning of the original, and the Church, for the best of reasons, has always been jealous of any change in her consecrated formulae. In the case of Greeks and Syrians, the danger is reduced to the minimum, as the Eastern nations are proverbial for their conservative spirit. In the second place, the use of one language in the Mass is a matter of convenience amounting almost to a necessity. There is scarcely a single passage in the text of the Mass that is not a subject of rubrical legislation. The decisions of Roman congregations, standing committees of cardinals, and the writings of rubricists on the language of the Mass are voluminous. Now, Suppose they had to deal not with one language, but with hundreds. Difficulties would multiply indefinitely. Furthermore, in the case of bishops and priests travelling in foreign countries, the offering of the sacrifice of the Mass would be attended with the greatest difficulty. The travellers would have to know the language of every country they passed through, unless they carried their Mass books with them, which would be very inconvenient, and even if they did so, they could not be understood by the servers, whilst the people would be surprised, perhaps shocked, by the strange sounds accompanying the sacred rites. And they certainly would not understand the words any better than our English congregations understand the Latin. A Catholic priest can celebrate the Holy Sacrifice in nearly every part of the world in which he happens to be travelling. And, we may add, a Catholic layman on a foreign strand can have the delicious feeling of being at home once he enters a church to hear Mass. The stock objection against the use of Latin is that it is not understood by the congregation. This objection was never made by anyone who was familiar with Catholic life and devotion. Did the objector ever see a Catholic congregation hearing Mass? Did he ever see the people approaching the altar rail to receive Holy Communion? If he did, he must have been convinced that language was an insignificant thing compared with the great action that was being performed. Our separated brethren have lost their grasp of the idea of sacrifice as connected with religion. They know nothing of the great action by which the sacrifice of the cross is perpetuated in an unbloody form. To them, language is everything, and consequently the linguistic objection appeals to them with double force. And yet Catholics might stake their case upon the assertion that they are accustomed to an intelligible language in the services of their church. The writer of the present article has never known a day from childhood, and after he had learned to read his English prayer book, when he did not know the meaning of every sentence the priest uttered at the altar. The meaning of the Latin was given in the English equivalent, and besides the English rendering, there were indications at intervals of what was going forward at the altar, whilst in some prayer books there were explanations of the several parts of the Mass considered as commemorations of distinct parts of Christ's Passion. At solemn Masses he had the additional pleasure and advantage of hearing a language musical in itself, rendered doubly musical by the alternate chant of sanctuary and choir. If all this is true, the language difficulty is a mere abstract or a priori one, and is easily dissolved by the application of one or two facts. What we have said of the Mass is applicable to the Vespers and the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. But it must not be forgotten that apart from the prayer book, the vernacular is not by any means banished from our churches. Not only are the Gospel and Epistle read to the people in English, and the sermon or instruction given in English, but there are many public devotions, both on Sundays and on weekdays, which are exclusively in English. There is probably more English heard in Catholic churches in a week than in Protestant churches in a month.